Keir, very, very good evening to you. I appreciate that we might be looking back at this time tomorrow night and saying, what a damp squib. It was billed as this major meeting, a moment of potential breakthrough, and basically nothing's happened. But it also has the potential, the possibility, does it not, to actually be quite a seismic and historic day tomorrow evening.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you summed it up very well in your intro. There are so many different balls in the air at the moment and so many ways they could bounce that we simply have no idea what's going to come out. I think, though, that by this time tomorrow, we might still not be in the clear about exactly what has gone on, because one thing that's very common to all of these meetings and all of these discussions between Trump and Putin is when they come out of the room, what's being reported by the Russian side and what's being reported by the Americans is usually very, very different. And it takes some time to figure out what actually went on and what was in fact agreed. So I think it's going to be a while before the real impact of whatever happens when they get behind closed doors becomes clear. But I'm leaning very much towards the later angle that you talked about. This is likely to be potentially disastrous. And the best case scenario is that it is a write-off because Putin succeeds in offending Trump.
What's your fear, Keir? What's your worry about it being a disaster?
There really are no limits to what Putin could demand and what Trump could agree to, because you talked about the way in which Trump is the leader of the free world, the United States, still the cornerstone of European security. Putin will be preparing to exercise his amazing skills at twisting history and injecting lies and disinformation to make Russia's position look perfectly reasonable. And we've seen time and again how Trump and those around him have been perfectly content to repeat what the Russians tell them, to parrot all of this nonsense about the existence of Ukraine, the dangers posed by the West actually defending itself, all the things that Russia wants to convince the naive and gullible people in the West that it's not Russia's fault. Now, if Trump comes away once again convinced that it's actually Ukraine's fault that the war started, then that could set in motion a range of different possibilities, right up to and including what Trump was threatening to do in the first place, which is withdraw for support from European security altogether, and effectively leave us where Russia wants us, which is undefended.
Is that a real possibility, you think, following those talks tomorrow?
I wouldn't be surprised if that is in Putin's mind as a possible outcome for what comes through tomorrow. Because let's look at what Russia has stated over and over again as its objective, what it actually wants to achieve. In the so-called draft treaties that it put to the United States and NATO back in December 2021, but even before then, what they've asked for is a new European security architecture, they call it. In other words, changing how European defense and security works, effectively removing the Americans and making sure that there's no obstruction to Russia getting what it wants. That's been the long-term aim, not only over years, but actually over decades for Russia. And Putin must be able to taste how close he is to it now.
When you talk about worrying about what Trump might or might not agree, Keir, I mean, to an extent, how much can he agree anything? Because this is not his country, it's not his territory, it's not his government that we are talking about here. We are talking about Ukraine, its land, its people, its sovereignty, and its leader, its democratically elected president, will not be part of the talks. So how much actually can be agreed given Zelensky won't be there?
That's a really important point, because Trump can agree whatever he wants and already has in the past. He's agreed to a lot of Russia's demands, but then actually forcing Ukraine to accept them is an entirely different matter. Now, Trump has a lot of leverage over Kiev, and he's already used it in the way that he has suspended support for Ukraine in order to bend Vladimir Zelensky to his will. But, of course, with all of the time that goes by, Ukraine is getting stronger and less dependent on the United States. It's getting more support from Europe. It's developing its own defense industries very rapidly. It's really only the intelligence support that the United States was providing that proved to be the key lever to force Kiev to actually accept some of the
leverage that he still has over Zelensky, the extent to which he can force or bounce Zelensky into doing something that the Ukrainian president doesn't want to do it's relatively limited.
It's less as time goes by. Yeah. It's still strong, but exactly how strong it is, it's only people sitting in Kiev that will actually know. And it's only them that will know to what extent Ukraine is capable of fighting on without US support or even possibly with active US opposition. But it might come to that. If the United States tries to force Ukraine into concessions to Russia which are fatal to its own survival, then they might conclude that actually it is better to fight on than to accept the kind of settlement for peace that Trump agrees to to with Putin.
And if that happens, there's going to be a big question for our government and Germany and France and others, isn't there? Because if the US steps back even more, there will be pressure, not least from Ukraine, for UK and our allies, the coalition of the willing, as Keir Starmer likes to call it, to step up, spend more, send more, Keir. And there will be a yes or a no from our governments about whether they are willing to do that in the US's
Well, that
absence.
ought not to be a question, given how many times our government and others in Europe have said that they are committed to Ukraine remaining a sovereign state and to its continued survival. Now, if any of those countries mean it, there should be no question about the fact that they're supporting Ukraine. But let's think back to when that phrase about the coalition of the willing first came out. That was back in February, 6 months ago, when we had an identical situation to what we've got now. A ceasefire being apparently negotiated between Trump and Putin over the heads of Ukraine and Europe, sending European leaders scrambling to do something to prove that they were actually relevant to their own future. 6 months later, what do we actually see as a result of that? Again, you've got the same panicked scramble at the last minute to try to get in touch with Donald Trump, to try to lay down a baseline of facts and what he should not give away to Putin without being part of that conversation, because there's nothing to contribute.
Let's just finish talking about strategies, if we could, Keir, because, there's a diplomacy, there's the groundwork, there'll be the advisors, there's all the kind of infrastructure on both sides. But ultimately, what will happen tomorrow is two quite literally extraordinary men will sit opposite each other, and it will be a test of their mettle, it will be a test of their negotiating skills, it will be a test of their grasp of what's actually going on in Ukraine and so on. How do you think the two leaders will approach their talks tomorrow?
Well, even before we get to that, it is an unequal contest, because all of those elements that you talked about, the diplomacy, the groundwork, the advisors, they're all only happening on the Russian side. The United States has got rid of most of its Russia advisors, most people who knew and would be able to advise on how exactly Putin might approach this problem and what he wants.
But that's reassuring, isn't it? That's really reassuring. So Donald Trump is not getting much advice at all on how to handle a really, really momentous, consequential meeting with Putin.
I've no doubt he may be getting advice, but it's from the wrong people, and whether he listens to it or not is another question altogether.
So how do you think he'll approach? I mean, I appreciate trying to predict what Donald Trump might do. It's not an easy matter, Keir, but what's your sort of best guess of how he'll approach this?
It's very hard to tell what exactly Trump thinks his relationship with Putin is, but the consistent pattern over all of this time is the one thing he's absolutely unwilling to do is offend Putin, is to do something that Russia is not going to like. So going in with that mindset means that he is likely to agree to whatever it is that Putin asks. And this is the key fear, of course, across the whole of Europe, because of all of the times when Trump has shaken his tiny fist and stamped his tiny foot and said there are going to be severe consequences for Moscow, but it never actually happens. It's always say, it's never do. And that is just an indication of the fact that he is never in a position where he's willing to take the steps that would be needed if he were actually to exert some leverage on Russia.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you very much for coming on. Keir Giles, Senior Consulting Fellow at Chatham House for the Russia and Eurasia programme. What do you think? Is this going to be a case of cometh the hour, cometh the slightly orange man in the White House, rising to the moment, confounding his critics and outfoxing Vladimir Putin to secure once and for all a ceasefire in Ukraine and with it the future of Western security? Or is the opposite going to be far more likely to unfold in your view? Trump being completely and utterly outplayed by Putin, capitulating, being charmed, being manipulated into doing something that proves to be a historic catastrophe, not just for Ukraine potentially, but for NATO and for Western security as well. How do you think it will play out? How confident are you that Donald Trump, representing in these talks the role, the significance of the West, will come out on top?